My name is Sudakhya Routray, and this is my first presentation. And I'm really honored to present here in this International Conference of Philosophical Counseling. Philosophy has always been more than a mere subject for me. It is something that has helped me throughout my journey from undergrad to master's and now. And I believe that it has been a counselor to me before I knew what philosophical counseling was. A genuine interest in existentialism, phenomenology, as well as philosophical counseling led me to Ludwig Binswanger and his theories, which is why today I'm bringing forth an analysis of Ludwig Binswanger's existential psychotherapy as opposed to Freudian psychoanalysis. The next slide, please. So I would like to begin with a general introduction to who Ludwig Binswanger was. He was a Swiss psychiatrist and a pioneer in the field of existential psychotherapy. He came from a family which was already well established with medical as well as psychiatric traditions. His father and grandfather were big names in psychiatry. And he himself is considered to be the most distinguished of the phenomenological psychologists, and is the most influential in making the concepts of existential psychology known throughout the world. In 1907, Binswanger received his medical degree from the University of Zurich as a young man, and he worked and studied with some of the greatest psychiatrists of that time, such as Carl Jung, Eugen Bleuler, and Sigmund Freud. The next slide. The next slide, please. Yeah, the objective in this paper is to discuss how existential psychotherapy, that is part of philosophical counseling, is a methodology in clinical psychology, and compare it with Freudian psychoanalysis to show how a philosophical approach in existing psychological techniques can help them understand the patient better. Yeah. To begin with my introduction, the next slide. So the development in clinical psychology took a turn when Ludwig Binswanger looked for an alternative to the ongoing trends in psychology. His fight against the orthodox psychiatry emerged when he found that theories such as
sorry to reject, please.
So his Freud psychoanalysis or behavioral theory was not enough to explain the ongoing human psyche, and they merely treated individuals as biological data. He was frustrated by the limits in psychology following the methodology of Freud and believed that there was a need to apply an anthropocentric methodology in here to treat humans more than this biological data. And his search ended when he found Heidegger's Being in Time, which he believed provided an understanding of the psychology of individuals in its first section. Binswanger expressed how psychology and philosophy were closely related, and applying philosophical methodology in psychology would elevate the process of that time. Next slide, please. Yeah, Binswanger, who himself was involved with Freud very closely, conducted a reading of Freud before he immersed himself with the work of Heidegger and Husserl. He met Freud when he was accompanying Jung and his wife in Feb 1907, and they developed a friendship that lasted until the end. Freud's attitudes towards Binswanger was that of a father to a son. Even though they had a close relationship, their path diverged when it comes to their methodology in psychology. Binswanger, who believed that Freud is and remains a scientist his whole life, was himself brought up as a scientist, but did not wish to remain so. Which is why I believe he felt that Freud's psychoanalysis as a basis for understanding a man needs more, and is not able to fully grasp man's true essence in life at its current pace. Binswanger, who draws his work from psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and a philosophical heritage, was his pupil and worked towards a defense of psychoanalysis at one point. However, His path diverged, but originally his motive was to coexist with Freud rather than to follow him or merely like take a distance from him. According to him, Freud's psychoanalysis was at that point in a scientific isolation where it was within the periphery of academic psychiatry, but would not do justice when applied to individual subjective experiences. So here we can notice how Binswanger's overview towards the fight against orthodox psychiatry was once invested in Freud, but was taken up by attempting to transform it in, and introducing an anthropocentric approach in psychiatry. It becomes clear when we discuss his own Daseinsanalysis or existential therapy later on. However, what we need to focus on right now is how Binswanger believed that there needs to be a critical operator that could work between psychiatry and philosophy, and and he believed psychoanalysis would act like that. Next slide, please. My point here is that to demonstrate that while Binswanger was looking for a new method in psychology, he believed that psychoanalysis still plays a big role. He claimed that psychoanalysis is a method that would work with both biology and psychology and weaves together a view that he calls a science of life, as opposed to how Freud saw it as a science of nature. Binswanger believed that in order to understand consciousness in its extreme, the epistemological promise should tend toward a phenomenological research and should welcome a revision in psychoanalytic concepts. In his letter to Freud, he talks about how once he had turned to phenomenology and existential analysis, conceived the unconscious in a different way, the problems that it presented became broader and deeper, and these problems were less defined as merely the opposite of conscious, whereas in psychoanalysis, it is still largely seen as this opposition. So Heidegger's existential analysis takes at its points to depart not from consciousness, but the existence conceived as being in this world. Accordingly, the opposition in question recedes into the background into the favor of description of various phenomenological demonstrable modes and structures of being in the world. Next slide. Binswanger takes over the account of Dasein as being in the world and tries to develop an alternate account of therapy based on the view of the person. Now, this way, one can walk away from the analytic method of natural sciences that explains the person only as an object understandable through causal relationship. He quotes, Dasein asserts something about itself when it exists, such as the fact that it has this or that capability or engages in this or that activity. It is being there, something which is present outside of itself in only a way which allows it to recognize itself. Binswanger discovered in Heidegger a structure that explains mental illnesses and the emergence from it in a way that it accounts for the essential aspects of being a person, something that natural sciences were not able to do. Heidegger's methodology allows psychology to understand the inherence of the external world around a person towards other people, while his account of Dasein's existence also is a continual relationship to itself and projects itself to the future that is captured by the lived experiences of the person. Next slide. So the Heideggerian study of Dasein focuses in the average everydayness of Dasein to reveal the understanding of being. This being it itself does the everyday thing. It acts in relationships to the world and other people. The Heideggerian approach, as opposed to the Freudian one, gives us a coherent analysis of how a person can change and grow over a period of time, which indirectly facilitates a therapeutic change in the process of therapy itself. The Freudian approach have a very little theoretical apparatus when concerned with the wellness and a positive experience within therapy itself. So in this everydayness, the being is sometimes alienated and ignored of the full possibilities that are the potentials and part of its own existence. Now, this understanding of a restricted living with a person encountered in their everydayness can help them emerge from this mere mode of existence once it has been acknowledged. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So world designs are a big part of Binswanger's theory. So in his case studies, Binswanger uses the notion of world design to describe the experiences of his patient, many of whom have suffered from psychological issues. So a world design in existential psychotherapy is a person's worldview or fundamental orientation towards life. And basically it is the existential mode of being in the world. A person's world design includes the way in which the person integrates totality of their personality with the world as they experience it. In this approach, understanding a person's world design is essential in understanding the person themselves. Binswanger and many other existential psychologists make a point of discovering their client's world design and in their therapy. So what Binswanger is concerned here is to know your Lebenswelt, which is Husserl's word for the lived world. Uh, he looked for a concrete everyday worldview. So he will, for example, try to understand how you see your umwelt or the physical world, which includes things such as buildings, trees, furnitures, etc. around you. He will want to understand your midwelt or the social world. Here, we are talking about the relationship of individuals to communities, to cultures, and so on. And then he would want to understand your eigenwelt, which is your inner world. It's your relationship. It's your relationship with your own personal world. It includes the body, the mind, and whatever you feel is most central to your senses of like who you are. The case. Next slide, please. Next slide. In my paper, I did a case study which involved one of Freud's patient who later on went to Binswanger. She was a 26-year-old Italian woman with a severe case of hysteria. Here, in this presentation, I would focus merely on the methods that Binswanger used during the treatment. He basically outlined the patient's record, first included a history, then a cathartic treatment, along with psychoanalytic advice. Now, Binswanger explained that he used the cathartic method at the beginning of psychoanalysis, usually to induce a state of bodily and emotional relaxation. It would often help the patient to disclose details of their life. During this, the woman in our case study talked about her relationship with her mother, as well as her experiences in the childhood, which we later find out that were the cause for her hysteria, her condition. In treating this patient, Binswanger utilizes a number of different psychotherapeutic interventions. Catharsis, psychoanalysis, behavioral treatment, and of course, physical interventions were part of it. Although he claimed that an existential relationship had to underlie these various practices in order to render them effective, this basis apparently neither decreed what sort of intervention would be attempted nor excluded any. Binswanger's view that a person or a Dasein, not as a static being, but as fundamentally embodied individual. Indeed, for Binswanger, the person is imbued with an embodied sense of agency and is always involved in ways of moving throughout the world. The next, which brings us to our conclusory question, I would say, why existential therapy? Now, the essence of existential therapy is the relationship between the therapist and the client, which is called an encounter. And an encounter is the genuine presence of a Dasein, one Dasein to another, which is an opening up of one to the other. Unlike the formal therapies such as Freud's or more technical ones such as behaviorist, an existential therapy is more likely to be involved with you. transference and counter-transference are seen as a natural part of the encounter, not to be abused, of course, but not to be avoided either. The existential therapist is more likely to be natural with you, quite often listening, but sometimes expressing their own thoughts, experiences, and even emotions. Being natural also means acknowledging the difference between you two. The therapist has the training and the experience, after all, but it is the client who has the problem. Existential therapy is more like a dialogue and not a monologue by either the therapist or the client. And the existential analysis has its goal in the autonomy of the client, like teaching the children how to like ride a bicycle. You may have to hold up to them, but eventually you have to let go. They may as well fall down, but you never let them. This is part of the learning experience. So if the essence of Dasein is being human, it is freedom and responsibility for one's own life, and you can't help them become more fully human unless you're prepared to release them. So with this I conclude my presentation. Thank you so much.